remember the first promo materials I received for summer camp when I was 9. This was a boys' camp in northern Minnesota, and on the box of the promotional VHS was a white sailing boat gliding across a sparkling lake, 6 boys and a counselor in neon shirts smiling and giving a big thumbs up, and just generally having an inconceivable amount of carefree fun. It took me 18 years to find out where I belonged in that photo. I was a camper for 4 summers. Now, for those of you who've been to camp, you're immediately going to know something's wrong with that number. There are generally 2 types of campers. One-year campers who conclude accurately that this is nothing less than a cult. And camp vets who stick around for 10 years and imagine alternative universes where they go to camp for 9 months of the year and school for 4 weeks. And truth be told, I was both. Being a camper was great because it allowed me to be myself for 4 weeks. And that was a gift because growing up I was kind of a weird mix. As a camper, I loved activities like baseball in a way I never loved them back home. At home, baseball was competitive. At camp, baseball was a fun game. But I was also exploring identities, so I was the only kid running the bases with Jinko jeans flapping around knobby legs, pants held up by one hand. Strangely, I never seemed to be featured in the camp videos. I stuck out as a camper, and this wasn't always conducive to those close, arms around each other, crying as you say goodbye camp friendships you hear about. Some years my differences were an asset, like when I got to pick the song for the camp lip sync competition, the Scooby-Doo theme song for those wondering. But my second to last year at camp, those differences got me into my first and only fist fight. After weeks of taunting related to knowing what specific Coolio lyrics were about, or how to say a certain word in Japanese, things came to a head. Terrifyingly, I won. We were both total novices and were grabbing around at each other's favorite t-shirts and stretching them, our arms swinging wildly like haywire robots. Only one punch connected, and that was mine. Blood rushed down his nose and spilled all over his white shirt. I would have fainted if the adrenaline wasn't keeping me on my feet. Our counselor ran in and asked what was going on, and we all said that Joe needed help with his nosebleed, which had clearly gotten out of control. The following year, when a camper pushed my head into a bedpost, and I later felt a leak of blood matting part of my dyed red hair, I figured the baseball and the lip syncing weren't worth it. So why in the world did I go back to be a counselor the first chance I had at 19? In that sense of boundlessness so many of us feel at 19, I wanted to show I could be anything. I was pledging a fraternity. I was in a rock band. Watch this, I could be a camp counselor. Yet when I became a counselor, I realized there were still kids at camp whose adolescence was as painfully and transparently vulnerable as mine. And being there for those kids made being a camp counselor very meaningful work. And oh dear Lord, how I fit in with the counselors. It was the most spectacular feeling. I made a best friend that summer, Joel, whose floor I'd later sleep on during job interviews in New York. I had a summer sweetheart across the lake at the girls' camp. I had a full head of hair. How effortlessly my full head of hair clung to my skull. Just showing off like a field of goddamn daisies. Fitting in, it turned out, looked and felt exactly as I had imagined it as a camper. I went back to be a counselor for the last time this summer at 27. For years I had recurring dreams about returning to camp, but it never made sense in the real world. Internships and career always took precedent. But now I'd gotten into business school, and I'd be leaving New York, and my best friends, and a life I loved to try and fit in again in Texas. Well, if I needed practice in fitting in, ironically, camp was one of the best places I knew to hone that skill. One night at the sailing docks, I learned the best lesson I know about fitting in. As the oldest counselor in camp, I was put in charge of a cabin of 15-year-olds. Every night we would participate in an evening activity, and this night happened to be sailing. As our cabin walked to the boathouse, campers started putting together their sailing crews. Now, counselors were much more involved since I was a camper, and we were constantly on guard to keep cliques from spending too much time together. The sailing veteran campers, the Chicago kids, 3 French kids inseparably grouped, discussing in French what they assured us was the latest camp song. We split up the campers as randomly as possible, but the conversation then shifted to which counselors would accompany which boats. Of the 4 of us counselors, 3 were asked, but not me. This turned out to be convenient for sailing because the boats were now divided perfectly for a sailing staff member to accompany each boat. I stood alone at the docks as the boat shipped off. I came back to camp to relive the magic of camp friends and being included just like everyone else. Instead, I felt like I was reliving the exclusion that 15-year-olds seem singularly able to deliver. I was by the life jackets when Rob showed up with a big smile. Now, Rob and I had gotten to know each other installing the docks back in May when the water was still icy cold. Rob's Northern Irish hands were the most gnarled, work-ready hands I'd ever seen. His thumbnails, traumatized from rogue hammer strikes and botched crowbar pulls, stopped growing in more than halfway. So you could say he made a floating wilderness instructor. Rob and I got in our motorboat and towed the sailboats as they drifted to the shore. We talked about our cabin, about being in Minnesota, and then suddenly life beyond camp. Somehow it only then struck me that I was getting to spend this evening with my new best friend at camp. And while we weren't going to show up in the camp postcard in our motorboat, we were still helping the boats that would be, and we were part of this equation. With the sailboats now gliding elegantly over the pine-curtained lake, I watched the clouds fade from pink to navy. And over the boat's motor, I heard a nearby X-boat full of laughing campers and saw a counselor give me a big thumbs up. I felt a sense of peace, realizing that I did belong at camp, just not the same way I had before. The realization in the motorboat that evening has stuck with me. I'm fortunate that there are areas in my life where I'm in the sailboat, when I'm with my family or my friends in New York. And sometimes I'm in the motorboat. Believe it or not, many of the people who played competitive baseball and avoided JNCOs are now in business school. Try as I might, it seems that if I let on the smallest differences to some, that's enough to draw rejection. The good news is, just about everywhere I go, there's a motorboat and someone to share it with. It's so easy to buy into being the counselor on the camp postcard with 6 laughing kids and a sunset. Just outside the frame, though, there are 2 weirdos towing them when they run into the shore. And they are having a blast, too.